I think everyone in the industry can relate to working with someone who says, we need a burst. We need, like, we're on the right path. The logo needs to be bigger. Make it pop. I think
Yeah,
everyone has
make
heard
it
this. I'm
pop.
just
That's a
like,
big one.
what does that mean? Like, I don't know what that means. Welcome to another episode of Brushing Up. And today we're going to talk about feedback. Cody wrote a really interesting blog post about this topic, specifically giving and receiving effective feedback when you're working with clients, which is a vital topic for freelancers, for designers, illustrators. And luckily, Cody has a lot of experience with this. So why do we want to talk about this topic? Why is this so important to you?
There's a lot of confusion around feedback on, especially as creatives. I think sometimes we lose sight, specifically in design, that is a form of visual communication in design.
Mm,
And sometimes it's hard to kind of figure out exactly like what is good feedback, what is bad feedback, and how to take it. And sometimes it also can be very abrasive to creatives. And there's just like I think there's just overwhelmingly this wall of like confusion around it in general. And I know that when I first started out, like when I was going to school, it was we did a lot of critiques and they were kind of brutal. I think there's a difference sometimes also in the type of feedback we receive, and but ultimately it's about communication. It's about getting the right communication out of your client. So I think it's kind of like the key to unlocking your full potential in your work. It allows you to grow. And I think it's really vital in all creative fields, illustration, surface pattern design. It can really make or break a project when you're getting
mm,
commission, working freelance, and making your portfolio work better in general.
yeah. If I think about projects that I've done with clients, where if I think about the best kind of projects I've done and the worst kind, or where I feel like things just didn't really go well, or where I feel like I wasn't really proud of what I was doing, has everything to do with the communication with the client and not with the designs themselves. Because it's all about what you said about the feedback you get, or how you're communicating with someone that can make you do your best work. And if that communication just isn't there, if that just isn't working, it's going to be really difficult to do your best.
Yeah, and I think that's something that, especially at first, you kind of clunk your way through. You're not really sure. I mean, if you're a
Mm,
good communicator to start with, then maybe not. But I think a lot of us, in general, like struggle with this. I know I do, especially if you're introverted, if you're quiet. Like it's really hard to kind of get over those hurdles, especially when with feedback. I know it's a lot of struggle with illustrators and service pattern designers or freelance designers. Kind of getting feedback in general from art directors. That was a big thing I learned
mm,
as an art buyer. And then just in my in-house experience as a designer and illustrator, everyone's so busy, it's like hard to get that feedback, but sometimes that's kind of lost sight in the background for if you're working with clients. You get a client though that they actually hire you for working on something. It's important that you kind of go into it knowing some ways to understand that feedback that you are getting and ways to and strategies to kind of like pull that out of them.
yeah.
I worked with a lot of artists and I know that that was a big thing that they really liked is getting any feedback. So it was kind of really great learning for me on the other side of it and taking forward when I went on my own. It's kind of like giving me a little bit of clarity in how to best ask the right questions.
Yeah, I'm thinking as well of how important feedback is. I mean, obviously, you have loads of experience from different perspectives, right? As an art buyer, working in an agency. But if you're doing all of those things by yourself, if you're your own business, then all of those roles fall onto you. So it's not just your job as a designer or an illustrator to do the designing, but also to find a way to communicate. And that's a skill in itself. That's a lot of pressure on people to do all of those things and to deal with clients the right way. But once you find a way that works for you, the designing part becomes more fun as well. It's a lot easier to do it that way. So it's just really
Yeah.
important for people to learn to what you said, ask the right questions, to set the right expectations for working with a client. Because sometimes they also just don't know how to give feedback because they've never done it before or they've never worked with an illustrator. And yeah, kind of have to set the right expectations there as well so that they understand.
Yeah, and I think the main points for feedback is constructive
Mhm.
criticism, clear communication, and like a collaborative approach. I think going into the mindset that feedback in general is to help you grow. It's not, I think it's really hard a lot of times also for creatives because when they create something, it's a very vulnerable act. It's like you get really, it's easy to get attached to something. And so I think by adapting a mindset that feedback is to make you better, make your work better, allow you to grow, allow you to be a better creator, then
Mhm.
it's just going to benefit you more in the end. It's not about this personal connection to your work anymore. It's about making the best possible work that you can and fulfilling your clients' needs. So,
Conclusion, that is it. That is
yes,
the most important part. Yeah.
yes. So I think the most important part is understanding feedback. It's a delicate balance. It requires giving or receiving feedback, being open to new ideas, and prioritizing clear communication and constructive criticism. What do you think is constructive criticism? Like, how would you describe that?
It goes hand in hand with feedback, right? But in a way that things can be improved, in a way that you can apply it to the work instead of just pointing out the negatives.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think it's also, it's not just all about the negative, it's also about pointing out what's working. Because sometimes
Mhm.
I think when you receive feedback, it's when it's all about the wrong, creatives can overcompensate and change the stuff that's good about it. So it's basically this balance of knowing what's good or what's working and what's not working, and
Mhm.
then making those changes into improving the areas that are not working. I think with constructive criticism, it doesn't have to be negative. It's more on the focus on how your work can be improved. It's not about dwelling on what's wrong.
That's a good one because I think if you receive a lot of negative criticism, you might even chip away at the things that the client or the person on the other side actually liked. But you didn't know that that's what they actually wanted to see more of. And then everything just becomes negative.
I know this happened a lot when I worked in house. Sometimes the feedback would, like, I think we all can relate to this, be like, it's just, it's not working. Like, that's
Mhm.
literally all year. This is not
Yeah.
working.
The logo
And
needs to be bigger. We need more epic
yeah,
colors. We need, yeah, all of that.
yeah, I got like, it needs a burst. I'm like, okay, well,
A what? A purse?
a burst, like a burst element to like emphasize something.
Oh
But
my
that's really what they meant is like they wanted that emphasize. And sometimes, I remember early on, I would do like all these like major changes, like it had to be like this overhaul of stuff. And then I realized sometimes over time that really it's only changing one tiny thing.
that's a good
Especially when
one.
in my experience in working with art directors, is that like they just wanted one tiny thing adjusted, and it went through. It was fine. So, and help yourself in getting past that is asking, okay,
Mhm.
well, what exactly is working, or what do you think is not working?
I think everyone in the industry can relate to working with someone who says, we need a burst. We need, like, we're on the right path. The logo needs to be bigger. We need more sensational colors. We need it, make it pop. I think
Yeah,
everyone has
make it
heard this. I'm
pop.
just
That's a
like,
big one.
what does that mean? Like, I don't know what that means. And just like crying, looking at that email, just staring at your work. Like, what do I need to pop? I don't understand.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
It could just be mean like bolding the text or making it bigger, but you're not going to know until you can kind of like and I don't think you sometimes you're so eager at first to like just do this huge overhaul of everything. So you're like, "Oh, it's all crap." Like no. But it
And
just
learn
could
what
be
the
like,
magic element is of like, okay, well, I clearly am a beginner because I clearly don't know how to make things pop. Nobody knows. That's not a thing. But I guess what you're trying to say is like that you need to decipher what specific thing I can change that they think that's what it is, right? Because
Mhm.
they don't know how to tell you, how to communicate with you what it is that needs to be changed.
Exactly. Yeah. It's about kinda, like, really honing down with your client, whoever you're working with, exactly what they're thinking. That kind of brings me to the next point is collaboration strengthens the artistic process. I think that's a big part of like changing the mindset around feedback.
Yeah.
Because yeah, there is that whole like feedback in general. I think especially at first when you're new, is that it's bad and that it kind of builds makes you defensive, can even make you defensive if you
Mm,
take it that way. But if you approach it with the mindset that no, it's about making you grow, it's about making your work better, it's about fulfilling your clients' needs. It's really about collaborating and strengthening the whole process in your artwork overall. So, it's the collaboration between artists and the client.
mhm,
And if you view it this way, you're coming it from a student perspective. Feel like this is was a big turning point in my career is that my work is always going to be a learning process. So it becomes receiving and giving feedback becomes a learning process. Because I think even
mhm.
giving,
Yeah.
receiving, like giving feedback can be a learning process in itself. I mean, it was for me all those years I spent giving feedback to artists that I worked with, it informed me on how to ask the right questions. Just it was a lot of aha moments for me in communicating with them in general, which is really a huge part of feedback, giving,
Mhm.
receiving feedback, and used effectively, it can contribute to your artistic growth. So, really on target feedback accelerates project timelines and leads to better outcomes. The more you do it, the better you'll get and the better outcomes you'll get overall.
Yeah. And I think as well, if you find a way, I'm just constantly thinking of what is like working with clients. I don't know if that's a boring example to keep giving over and over, but that's all I can think about. If when you find a way to communicate with a client and it works, then that also means that for them it's easier, right? So they might come to you in the future because they're like, well, what I liked about this process is that you were able to find solutions in a really easy way for me, and the communicating was very clear. So I want more of that because somebody else also, especially with a business, they're always looking out for easy ways to communicate with people to get things done in the most efficient way. And if you can provide that on top of great designs, then that's a plus.
That's a really good point. The more you work with like the same client as well, you get to learn each other and you get to learn how each
Mm,
other work. If they know that they can easily the easiest, quickest way is to go to you, that is really beneficial. And that's how you're gonna
absolutely.
keep clients, that's how you're gonna get new clients because people know that when they work with you, they're gonna get clear communication.
And that actually now reminds me of, I think we talked about this before. I think it was the series episode about a couple of restaurants that I worked with where I maybe wasn't the best choice that they could find for someone doing the lettering in on their facades, on their chalkboards, on our murals, but I was the person that was the easiest to communicate with. So sometimes getting those clients or keeping clients, as you said, it's not just about the designs, but it's also about how you communicate, how you can efficiently work with them, especially if your client is a business that is itself on really tight deadlines, that struggles a lot with stress in their business, in their industry. They need someone else to come in and have even clearer communication and deal really well with feedback and ask the right questions so that they can move along quicker.
Yeah, I know it's like this with surface pattern designers and pitching their work. It's amazing if you even get a response from art director. So if you actually are manager are able to work with the client, effective communication, effective feedback, getting that from them, and it's essential. You're one of their go-to persons to when they have something.
Yeah,
You'll come to mind.
reliable.
It
Yeah.
was like that when I was an art buyer. I had my go-to artist. Sometimes it was like a specific thing I knew that they could handle well. I had immediate shortlist. So if you can really hone in on your communication and taking feedback, asking the right questions to help you receive great feedback, it will help you in gaining clients and making your work better. and making it better for their needs. Because that's the
Mhm.
whole goal, I think, in surface pattern design and illustration is meeting the needs of art directors. They're the
Yeah.
ones who know their market, they're the ones who know their company, they know all the information of what's selling. So, really being open to what they're telling you, if you're able to glean those facts from them in your working relationship, really can go a long way. Not taking it personally, not taking it as like, oh, this is my work. I don't want to change my work. If you approach it that way, you're not going to get very far. I think you're a little bit more open to hearing them out, like, because they're the ones who's the expert in where they're working at right now. They're good. They're the gatekeeper, essentially too. So
Yeah, because I mean, you cannot be stubborn, like, you're gonna have to change your designs. If not, you're, I think, more of an artist, which, I mean, not that artists never change their work, but, you can be you're allowed to be, like, less flexible because pieces speak for themselves and they are in itself done. Whereas as, a designer or an illustrator, you always have to find solutions to the problems that the client gives you, right? If the art director comes to you with a problem, you have to find a way to solve it. It's very unlikely that you already have a work that's your own ready to go and be like, here's your solution. Like, you're gonna have to find a way to make that happen somehow. You're talking a lot about working with art directors, right? And as I understand it, as an art buyer, you're kind of the art director of a team or not?
it's a little bit different. So the art director, in the case where I worked, and I think this is probably the case in most places, they're kind of the overall director of like the vision of the
Okay.
work.
Yeah.
Everything in the company that art director saw had to be the final approval through the art director, but like the art
Yeah.
buyer, like in my case, was more about acquisition. So in
Mhm.
terms of deciding which artists would be good to work on certain things, the entire workflow from assigning them work to giving any feedback that the art director had. And I also added my own feedback because I worked with the art director for so long that I kind of could tell over time that sometimes when she would say no to something, I knew it would work out if I gave the person, I said, well, this is maybe not gonna go now, but if you are open to trying this, this, and this, then I think it might get pushed through. And a lot of times it would because I had that experience working with the art director. I knew what they wanted changed. I was able to communicate that to the artist. So it's kind of like a go-between a little bit. It's like about
Okay.
working that whole acquisition process from the artist to the implementing of their artwork into the software and like having it printed and up on the website for the
Mhm.
company. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I just wasn't 100% sure what your relationship was to the art director, but that sounds like a really nice way to facilitate communication as well. I'm thinking of where can feedback go wrong, and I think it has a lot to do as well with how, not just on your side, but on the other side, when you're working with a small business, there is no art buyer or there is no art director most of the time. Or if you're just working for another person and they do everything by themselves too, then it's much more likely that they're gonna give bad feedback. Sometimes you're just gonna run into that, like there's not much you can do because they
Yeah.
just they either don't care or they don't really know yet what to do with this. And that can happen too. As I said, for example, with restaurants, most of the time, if it's a small business, they're not gonna have an art director in place. It's just gonna be sometimes just the boss directly,
Yeah.
or a manager, and they have no idea how to give, constructive criticism either. So sometimes you're just gonna run into that. And
That's
then it's
a
your job to be prepared with the
yeah,
right questions.
that's a really good point. I don't think there are a lot of, like, specific roles behind companies where there are just art buyers or people who are dealing with the acquisition process, and even if you do, they might not be a great communicator, so it's
Mhm.
just another barrier, or sometimes it's just the art director, and the art director is busy, and they might not have time to give you any feedback,
Yeah.
so it'll just be, like, a no, and you have no reason why,
Yeah.
like, at all, so,
But just like, "Okay,
um
great start." And you're like, "That was my final version."
yeah. Exactly. So, yeah, a lot of times it is, it's like either just someone who doesn't have enough time to give you feedback at all, or just who's not a creative at all, who's just like straight up the owner,
Mhm.
just the client. And so I think it's very common to come across that in which you'll get bad feedback. So my
Yeah.
next section is all about
Yeah.
beware of bad feedback, which is all about really comes down to poor communication, which can lead to bad outcomes. So this is where you get like revisions upon revisions upon revisions based on unclear and misguided feedback that can weaken a design rather than improve it, move the project away further away from the end goal. And yeah, this is, for example, when a client asks for a lot of revisions, causing frustration. So there are some ways that you can kind of push back against this a little bit. So I have a lot of times when I work freelancing with for a client, like who's just like the owner or something, I will put a revision clause. I will say, okay, this is how the process will go. And you get once I present kind of like I don't know if it's really the final version, but I basically will put in there there's only going to be two versions in there. And after that, it reverts to my hourly rate,
Yeah.
anything
Good
that's
one.
changed after that. So that's a big thing that you could do.
Instead of learning how to deal with the bad feedback, just stop the feedback, basically.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
that's really a valid thing to do. Like sometimes, you don't want to get into that trap. I think sometimes it's also about like discerning which clients are good clients really that are
Mhm.
good at being effective with their communication. I've just learned that over the years I don't really want to work with people who are not effective communicators, or if I do, I want to be paid accordingly. So and if they're
Mhm.
fine to working my hourly rate after so many revisions, and that's okay. But sometimes it's so frustrating process that I'll just be like, this is just not working out. We need to
Good point.
just cut our losses, or they're like, you can put a kill fee into
Yeah.
your contracts fee for at least doing whatever initial work that you've done. But you can also just, this is not working out. Like, and I've had to do that a
Yeah.
couple times. But yeah, I think
Yeah.
really if you're having a
Oh,
difficult time, it's really like pinpointing the right questions.
mhm.
So asking questions, linking it to the project goals, the target audience, the intended use. It's to help you understand the broader objectives so you can align your creative decisions to the end goal you're trying to achieve. So, and a lot of times, some of this, it
Mhm.
goes back to that whole delicate balance of what you want to listen to and what is more important. Some of it will come down to like your working relationship. Is it's a client that you've established a really long-term relationship, you'll get to know over time, like in working with them,
Yeah.
like what works, what doesn't work. You can also come up with questionnaires at the beginning of projects as well. This is more of, I guess, if you're more in the freelance sphere. If you're a surface pattern designer or illustrator who's pitching it to companies, sometimes this stuff doesn't come into play as much, like with the questionnaires and stuff like that. It's more like they'll just, for the most part, just give you a yes or a no. But if you can start asking questions, specifics, that overall will help you in discerning like
Yeah.
what is bad feedback, what to listen to, what, trying to pinpoint exactly what needs to be improved.
Mhm. Just in general, I think not just for feedback, but communication and just starting with a list of like, okay, what is it that I need to get started? And that doesn't just help me to prepare the right way. What are the deliverables? But also for them to be like, okay, we contacted this person. What do we need exactly? It helps them to get their ducks in a row. And then that will help you later on to get the right feedback, I think, as well, if you start with those right questions, because then they can see that you're organized, what can be expected from you, and how you set kind of the expectation for how they should communicate. And especially if there's not that kind of person in place or the form in place to take care of those things, then you can set those rules. You can start that way. And that
Yeah,
really helps too. I've totally made loads of mistakes in the beginning, but I mean, I learned from those. And then now I try to be really organized with that, and it really helps.
you can also put that on your website too. I've seen other surface pattern designers do it, and I think I've been thinking about how I can approach that
Mm,
and redoing some things on my website as well. You can actually put the entire process of what the client to expect in terms of like if you're a surface pattern designer, for example, you can put the whole process. They need to contact you. They'll get a portfolio link. They can say what they want or what they
yeah.
would like or if there's any changes that they want to see. Or I've even heard of clients who will like pick certain patterns. They're not part of a collection, but they'll think works well with some color changes, stuff like that. And then also that you pitch to a company and they want to work with you, if they have a contract, that can also be a starting point. You kind of get a sense of how the
Yeah.
communication is going to go in them answering your questions. And in regards to that, it kind of sets the tone of how you're going to work as well. Or if they don't have a contract and you have the contract, then even better, because then you can actually state in there all the requirements and the things that you
Yeah.
want in your contract in the working relationship.
Yeah. The revisions and things. Yeah.
Mhm. I had an art rep, I think it was last year or early last year, I can't remember, 2022. I had an art rep look at my portfolio. This was before I exhibited at Surtex. I wanted someone who's very
Mhm.
highly integrated into the surface pattern design market and community to look at my portfolio to make sure that the work I was presenting was as marketable as could be. So I had her look at my entire portfolio.
Could you also explain what an art rep does exactly?
Yeah, so an art rep, they can be really big agencies or they can be really small. They basically represent you
Mhm.
and your artwork to companies in getting your work licensed or sold. So they
Hmm.
really kind of have a finger on the industry in surface pattern design. They
Yeah.
basically represent like a handful of artists, but yeah, like I said, it could be also really like a lot of artists as well. They basically do a lot of marketing for you and pitching for you.
So that's the kind of person you could get a lot of valuable feedback from.
Yeah, and that's why I really wanted to have my work reviewed by someone who really had kind of like knowledge of the industry and what they're seeing is being most licensed to, what's being most sold
Mhm.
to the clients that they work with, because that's just going to make my work
Yeah.
better and more marketable. And man, it took like most of the time up until I showed to or do all the revisions based on her feedback, and it was really great feedback because it like did a
Okay.
really good job of highlighting just the things I needed to do to make it as marketable and presentable as possible for the show. I'm really happy
Yeah.
with all the changes that I made and how they looked. It just made me like my work so much better from that. And I think it's easy, especially when you
Mhm.
work for yourself, when you work from home, to get in a bubble.
Yeah.
For
Absolutely.
me, I become to really love getting feedback from other creatives and people in the industry because I just realized how much, especially after I see when you see the before and after, how much it's improved. And I think you'll
Mhm.
see once I show you a couple of these examples. So this first one, the before is on the left and the after is on the right. And this is a birthday card design.
Mhm.
This one ended up getting licensed after I made these changes. So the big thing that she said was the
Okay.
perspective. It was, like, really flat with the tabletop art and, adding the ombre gradient in the background, making because she said the cake didn't stand out very much, and, adding the confetti as well. I think this just looks so much better with the changes that I made.
Yeah, I think that looks really nice. Somehow, what I noticed first thing is there's a little bit of the different colors in the cake. There's a bit of blue in there, and then you can see that in the gradient as well. I mean, it's something that you don't necessarily consciously think about, but it really changes. It makes those colors pop. I don't like saying pop. I said it. I said it myself, but that was not my intention. But it does. That's the only thing I could think of.
No, it's a valid point to make. It does make it pop. I struggle with adding embellishment, so this was really good feedback to take, and it really didn't even take that much more to add. One of the big things that she said with the before on the left side here was purple. A lot of people either love it or hate it. I'm one of those people. I found
Mm.
myself in my portfolio noticing that I really love it, I guess, because I used it a lot. Especially in this particular piece. So I decided to go ahead and change the background color. And I actually ultimately love it a lot better with this more neutral color in the background. She also said the
Mhm.
same thing with the pattern on the table being too flat. So I made adjustments there. And I even changed the color up, making it a little bit more tonal because it was really distracting from the cake and, like, the balloons and stuff.
Mhm.
She said a bunch of other stuff about, like, how the patterns on the balloons she thought would be better tied to the cake more by using more of the patterns that are on the cake, which I thought was a really great point, and it tied to kind of like the overall piece together a lot more. Even on the hats, tying it into the cake
Yeah.
as well. And then it just made me want to, like, really improve the detail on the animals in general, and I think it just looks so much better. Another big thing that she mentioned was this making sure the smiley eyes were really, clear. You want really smiley eyes, that's a really big thing in making this as marketable as possible. So I'm really like, this is one that I did a lot of changes with, and I'm really happy with the after.
Yeah, I like that. That's the first thing I noticed, the lines, like the details in the animals. But I'm thinking as well of like the purple, that's really interesting because that's something that only someone who is in the industry would be able to pinpoint and say, look, here's the deal with purple. That's really specific feedback that you can use. That's very actionable, very constructive.
Yeah, I think if you can find someone who's as close to like the pulse of the industry that you're working in as a creative as possible, I think the better feedback you'll get. And so that's also something to take in
Good
mind
point.
when you're working and pitching to companies in the surface pattern design
Hmm.
industry. If you're lucky enough to get feedback from them, you need to take it and take it seriously because they're the ones who know their market and company, because you both have the end goal. You want this to sell for their customers, so
That's a good point. I really like this piece. It's really sweet. So I had a couple of things in mind that have really helped me over the years working with clients, and especially clients where there is no art director or not someone who can give really good feedback. So one of those things is to ask a client that comes to you what they already like about your work. And let me know if this is already too obvious. Like maybe this is something everybody already
no,
knows,
I
but
actually think that that's a good thought. It's best, I think, to know exactly, like, where they're coming from and what they like about your work, because then you can carry
mm,
that through in your project and working with them.
yeah, exactly that. Couldn't have said it better myself. To try and get a better idea of their thought process, right? To understand what's going on from their side, and that will hopefully make not just the communication better, the feedback, but also just the whole design process. Because what you want to be focusing on is start with the things that they already like about you. So an example is, well, if years ago, last year, I think somebody came to me who specifically came to me to make little brand illustrations, like spot illustrations for their agency. And what they started with is, hey, we saw your website and we really like these little icons that you did. And I initially just made these to for navigation on my website. Like that wasn't really part of my portfolio. But they really liked this because it was something that they thought could apply to their brand, just the style of it and the simplicity of those icons. So they specifically said, if you could do something that doesn't just in style reflect this, but also in the way that you simplify certain concepts, that'd be great. And that made the process afterwards and the feedback after a lot easier. So the sketches, they started, this is one of them. It started with like really abstract concepts of problems that they solve as a company. And how do you translate that into visuals? That's already difficult to do, but because I already kind of knew what the end result was supposed to feel like, that made it a lot easier. They were so clear on what they wanted, and I was so clear on what I had to do that the whole feedback process was just really short. So that's what I would say is a tip number one. Ask your client what they like about your work. And sometimes you're just going to get, oh, this one post on Instagram because we think it's just really pretty. That's better than nothing.
Like, a big thing I remember when I was an art buyer and looking at illustrators specifically, ones who didn't have enough experience in actual design, because
Mm-hmm.
there are a couple artists that we signed on who didn't have any design background, and you could tell because the company I worked for, you had to have some design background to at least, enough to be able to create work for that we required, and
Mm-hmm.
so a big thing I started doing after that first year of being an art buyer is that was often said was, "Will their work translate into our products. I think you kind of have
Mm,
to do that with your, like, if you're freelancing clients as well. Because
yeah.
sometimes there was one particular instance where we asked an artist, we saw a post that they had of some work they did on their website, or but it ended up not going through because basically I think it came down to whether or not that work translated. I think that's also a good thing to maybe keep in the back of your mind is when you're working with a client is when they say I really like this, also maybe take a little time to say, once you know what they want you to do, being like, Well, can that translate into their product
Mhm.
or the goal of the project?"
Good
Um,
one, yeah.
because you want to make sure that you can see it translating. Because if not, I think that sometimes can cause a lot of frustration.
Yeah, because sometimes maybe there just isn't a solution, like, maybe there's just no overlapping path, and that's not necessarily your fault, it's just that they maybe were hoping that you could figure it out, but sometimes there just is no solution. That's true.
Yeah.
This was from a couple of years ago, which I did for a client who is one person, and they do, official translations. How'd you call that? I should know. I forgot.
Um, Interpreter or translator? Or,
Yeah, like someone who translates official documents, basically. A
okay.
business that I have used, but I know absolutely nothing about. So what they wanted was a postcard that they could send out to all of their clients, which are businesses and people like me, with multiple languages and need to translate things all over the place. And I wanted a little card that kind of represented their business. I had no idea what that was supposed to look like. At that point, it's a good idea to ask questions. And that really helped me, like the right questions, not just like, okay, well, what do you kind of want this to look like? But also like, what what do you do day to day? What does your business look like? What do you think most represents you? And that's basically the story that this person told me. I basically put that into a visual. So I made this little card that had that basically represented her desk, her business with little elements that required asking a lot of questions, like what sort of objects would you have on your table that kind of show what you do and cannot be mistaken for anything else. Also stuff that's really personal. I decided to add this little like family portrait and these like books that she uses for her business. I asked for photos as well. That's how I figured that stuff out. That made that feedback process a lot easier because she felt understood.
Yeah.
This was the final result. That is to say that sometimes you're just not gonna know exactly what your client needs, but I mean that's why they're there. So try to ask questions about what they do and see if again if it translates, if your work is able to find them the solution that they're looking for. And then last thing, this is actually just from a personal project I did a while back. But what I wanted to mention, which is something that I've struggled with over the years with clients, is setting expectations. Especially all of these, by the way, all of these tips come from a place when you're working with clients that are really small. There's all kind of hurdles that you have to get over when you're working with a small client. One of those things is that they sometimes cannot see beyond initial ideas. They immediately want to see like the magic. They want to see popping colors and bright explosions and things like that. And they might not understand that what you are usually starting with is the preparation, a brief. What are the deliverables? And then the next part is usually, especially with illustration and design, little thumbnail sketches. For me, those usually look quite messy. I think for most people, it's going to look a little bit like this. You got really small little thumbnail sketches just to kind of figure out how do we represent things? How do you go from words to visuals? But if you send something like this to a client who has not worked with a designer before, I have found that they usually go into like, oh my God, why is there no color? What do you mean? Is this the final result? And then you have to calm them down and say, like, look, this is just the initial stage, but let's start with the concept first. So what I found really helpful is to just quickly explain the process of like, this is what we're going to do first. Don't worry, we're going to get to that point. I found that when you set those expectations first, then the feedback you're going to get after is not going to be focused on those little things that you can later fix, making the final illustration, but instead is going to focus on the things that you want feedback on, which is, okay, are you happy with the way that we translated this concept from words into visuals? What do you think of the way we represented, this as a layout? And then they're less worried about the result that comes after. And what I've even done before is when I used to just show like stylistic ideas of like we're still in a sketching phase, but you can expect something like this in terms of style, and just giving a few like little examples either from my own work or a couple of Pinterest ideas of like, so set expectations to get the right feedback.
Yeah. I think also going back to your little concept sketches that you have here, I tend to actually only show at least when I work freelance, more like rough proofs. It's a little bit more like the next stage after sketches. Although I've
Hmm.
worked with artists who will show me like what you've shown, like with sketches, which I
Yeah.
think works is just as effective. I do more like proofs, and in the past, I've noticed that a lot of times those proofs, the end product, at least with logos and stuff to design, there'll be like a mishmash of one or more proofs that I present. So it's just about like talking about through those ideas and kind of like figuring out like, well, this works in this area, but like maybe we can pull this from this other area. So yeah, it's just about like getting them to kind of communicate with you what their expectations and what they're wanting to get out of the whole project and process.
Yeah. So, what are some main takeaways that people should think about when with regards to feedback and communication?
I would say constructive criticism, clear communication, and a collaborative approach, but I would almost change that to a collaborative mindset.
So this applies to, I think, working with clients, right? But also working with maybe other artists and working with maybe someone who could have a look at your portfolio, like the example you gave, what you went through with an art rep.
I think it's really just anyone you're communicating about with your work,
Hmm.
and whether they're a client or you're wanting to establish a working relationship with them. It's just about being open to whatever constructive criticism they may have about your work and effectively communicating with them, making sure it's clear, just having a growth mindset when it comes to making yourself and your work better.
Yeah, I like that.
So we will make sure to put the blog post link in the show notes and
Hmm.
a link so you can download the guide.
I like the before and afters that you showed. I think that goes to show that getting specific feedback or feedback from someone in the industry can be so valuable and can really change what you can do with your work.
I think you could do that even with accountability partners that you work with. Show your work, online groups. One of our last
Hmm.
shows that we talked about online groups. So all of that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's a really good place to get feedback. I would also say I would actually love to know in the comments who has had funny feedback from clients. If anyone has had an equivalent of make the logo pop, please, please, please tell us because I can't wait to laugh my ass off.
Yes, I would love to hear that too. That just all the different varied responses.
That might be something for the future we could talk about. If we do a follow-up, we'll put it over here.
Yeah.
Okay, that's it for this episode, I think. Stay tuned for another episode coming up very, very soon. And that's it. Sorry, I got really distracted by your cat in the background, sitting in the back, and I just see like a tail moving, and it's just really funny. I think your cat saw a ghost.
He does this with like the lights that bounce off our phone, and
Oh, right.
he'll be transfixed for never seen a cat. Like we he's an orange cat, and we always are saying like all orange cats have one brain cell, and so it's like
Yes.
he's really putting that one brain cell to use with this fascination
Yeah.
with light. He gave a lot of entertainment.
Yeah.